Emergency Response Log, Jack Goslin, FDNY Hazmat Unit. Date, March 15, 2025. Time, 6h47. The snow started falling at dawn, but it wasn't snow. I've been working emergency response for 8 years now, following in my grandfather's footsteps. Henri Gosselin built half the fallout shelters in Queens during the Cold War. Always said preparation was the difference between living and dying. His blueprints still sit in my apartment, yellowed pages covered in precise measurements and emergency protocols. Never thought I'd need them. The call came in at 6:15. Unusual precipitation in Central Park, dispatch said. Possible chemical contamination. Standard hazmat response. Noah Gregoire, my partner and brother-in-law, was already suiting up when I arrived at the station. We've worked together for 3 years, ever since he married my sister Claire. Good man, solid under pressure. You see the weather report? Noah asked, adjusting his respirator. His French-Canadian accent always got thicker when he was nervous. No storm systems anywhere near the city. I checked my gear twice. Geiger counter, air quality monitor, sample containers. Everything my grandfather taught me about contamination response. The old man survived Chernobyl cleanup crews in the 80s, came back with stories that kept me awake as a kid. Whatever it is, we follow protocol, I told Noah. In and out, document everything. The drive to Central Park took 20 minutes through morning traffic. The ash, because that's what it was, not snow, fell steadily, coating windshields and sidewalks in a fine gray powder. People walked underneath it like it was normal precipitation, some even catching it on their tongues. Kids laughed and tried to make ash angels. My blood ran cold. Noah, check your counter, I said, pulling the Geiger counter from my kit. The crackling started immediately, a steady tick-tick-tick that made my skin crawl. The needle jumped higher than I'd ever seen it outside a training facility. Murd, Noah whispered, staring at his own readings. Jack, this is radioactive, I finished. The word tasted like metal in my mouth. We parked near the sheep meadow, where the ash was accumulating in strange patterns. Not random drifts like snow would make, but deliberate piles that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. A faint green glow emanated from the larger accumulations, barely visible in the morning sun, but unmistakable through our equipment. I grabbed the radio. Dispatch, this is Hazmat Unit 7. We need immediate evacuation protocols for Central Park. Confirmed radiation signature. Static answered me. Then, Unit 7, please repeat. Did you say radiation? Confirmed. Geiger readings are off the charts. This isn't snow, it's radioactive ash. The silence stretched long enough that I thought we'd lost connection. When dispatch finally responded, the voice was different. Supervisor level. Unit 7, maintain position. Do not approach civilians. Containment teams are en route. But people were everywhere. Joggers, dog walkers, tourists already taking photos of the glowing ash piles. A group of kids had built a small fort from the stuff, their parents standing nearby with coffee cups, oblivious to the danger. We can't just watch, Noah said, echoing my thoughts. These people. I looked at the nearest pile of ash, maybe 30 yards away. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like crushed diamonds mixed with grave dirt. Steam rose from where it touched the grass, and I could see the vegetation already beginning to wither and blacken. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory. Radiation doesn't care about your good intentions, Jacques. It just kills. But these were civilians. Families. Children playing in poison. Noah, start herding people back toward the street, I ordered. I'll sample the ash. We need to know what we're dealing with. Jack, the protocols. Screw the protocols. I checked my suit seals one more time. My grandfather didn't write procedures for watching people die. I approached the nearest pile, pulling out a sample container. The ash felt warm even through my gloves, and where it touched the metal of my tools, it left small burn marks. The Geiger counter's clicking became a frantic staccato as I got closer. That's when I saw the footprints. Human prints, but wrong. Too long, with claw marks at the tips. They circled the ash pile in a pattern that made my stomach turn. Whatever made those tracks had been walking on 2 legs, but the gait was off. Shambling. Uneven. Noah. I called out, but when I looked back, he was already running toward me, his face pale behind his mask. Jack, we need to leave. Now. What's wrong? He pointed toward the wooded area near the reservoir. I found more ash piles. Bigger ones. And there's something moving in there. The crackling of our Geiger counters suddenly seemed very loud in the morning air. In the distance, I could hear sirens approaching, but they sounded thin and inadequate against the scope of what we were seeing. I sealed the ash sample and looked one more time at the footprints. They led away from the pile, toward the treeline where Noah had seen movement. Toward the heart of the park, where hundreds of people took their morning runs. Emergency broadcast, I said into the radio, abandoning protocol entirely. All units, all frequencies. Central Park is contaminated with radioactive material. Immediate evacuation required. Repeat, radioactive contamination confirmed. Ash fell like snow over Manhattan, burning skin with toxic glow. But it was just the beginning. As we retreated toward our vehicle, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving between the trees. Too quick to be human, too large to be anything else. The Geiger counter's clicking followed us all the way back to the street, a metallic heartbeat counting down to something I didn't want to imagine. My grandfather's blueprints suddenly felt like prophecy instead of history. Emergency response log, Jack Goslin, FDNY Hazmat Unit. Date, March 15, 2025. Time, 14:30 Eastern Standard Time. The ash storms hit at noon. What started as gentle snowfall had become a howling nightmare that turned the sky the color of old blood. From the emergency command center we'd set up in the Times Square subway station, I watched the street-level feeds as winds carrying radioactive debris tore through Manhattan like the breath of some ancient, poisoned god. Readings are spiking again, Noah reported, his voice tight with exhaustion. We'd been down here for 6 hours, coordinating evacuations and sealing off contaminated areas. The Geiger counter's relentless clicking had become the soundtrack to our apocalypse. Whatever's causing this, it's getting stronger. I studied the radiation maps spread across our makeshift command table. The contamination wasn't random. It followed wind patterns, concentrated in specific areas, almost like it was being directed. The thought made my skin crawl, but I pushed it aside. Focus on what you can control, my grandfather always said. Save who you can save. How many people are still in the evacuation zones? I asked Emil Lagaci, the community leader who'd emerged as our civilian coordinator. The man was built like a linebacker, but had the organizational skills of a field general. Without him, we'd have lost hundreds more. Maybe 300 in Zone 1, another 500 in Zone 2, Emil replied, checking his list. But the storm's making it impossible to reach the outer groups. The ash is eating through our equipment. He wasn't exaggerating. The corrosive properties of the fallout had destroyed 2 of our vehicles already. The metal literally bubbled and dissolved where the concentrated ash touched it. I'd seen nuclear cleanup footage from Chernobyl, but nothing like this. We need to get them into the subway tunnels, I said. It's the only protection we have left. Noah looked up from the radio he'd been monitoring. Jack, there's something else. Reports are coming in from the outer boroughs. Brooklyn, Queens, they're seeing ash fall too. And, he paused, his face grim. There are reports of attacks. People being mauled by something near the contaminated zones. The footprints I'd seen in Central Park flashed through my mind. Too long, with claw marks at the tips. I'd been trying not to think about what could have made them. Animal attacks? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be worse. The witnesses say they looked human, but wrong, like they were changed. Emil crossed himself. Mon Dieu, what have we stumbled into? Before I could answer, the lights flickered. The emergency generator coughed, sputtered, then died completely. In the sudden darkness, the only illumination came from the sickly green glow seeping through the ventilation grates, ash light filtering down from the street above. Backup power should kick in, Noah said, but his voice carried doubt. We waited. Nothing. The ash must be interfering with the electrical systems, I realized. Same way it's eating through metal. A new sound joined the storm's howling, screaming from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system. Human voices, terrified and desperate. Station 14, Emil said immediately. We moved a group of families down there an hour ago. I grabbed my equipment kit and emergency flares. Noah, stay here and coordinate with any remaining units. Emil, you're with me. Jack, wait, Noah called out. The protocols say. The protocols didn't account for this. I met his eyes in the flare light. These people trusted us to keep them safe. I'm not abandoning them. Noah stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. Be careful, brother. Emil and I moved through the tunnel system by flare light, following the screams. The walls were already showing signs of contamination, patches of corrosion where ash had found its way through the ventilation systems. The Geiger counter's clicking grew more frantic as we descended. Station 14 was chaos. 20 families huddled in the center of the platform, while something moved in the shadows at the tunnel's edge. In the red flare light, I caught glimpses of what had been human, pale, elongated limbs, skin that seemed to bubble and shift like melting wax. The radiation had changed them, but they were still alive. Still hunting. "Get behind the barriers," I shouted to the civilians. Emil was already herding them toward the emergency shelter we'd constructed from subway benches and plastic sheeting. One of the creatures emerged fully into the light, and I had to fight down the urge to vomit. It had been a woman once. I could tell from the remnants of a business suit still clinging to its twisted frame. But the radiation had stretched her limbs unnaturally, and her face was a ruin of blistered flesh and exposed bone. Her eyes glowed with the same sickly green light as the ash. She moved with horrible purpose, not the shambling gait I'd expected, but a predatory stalking motion. When she opened her mouth, the sound that came out was part human scream, part animal shriek. "The children," a woman behind me whispered. "Oh God, the children." I looked where she was pointing and saw 3 small figures at the tunnel's far end. They'd been kids once, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Now they moved on all fours, their limbs elongated and twisted, their clothes hanging in radioactive tatters. "Emil, get everyone to the upper level. Now." "What about you?" I pulled out the emergency flare gun. "I'll buy you time." The first flare hit the adult creature center mass, and it shrieked as the phosphorus burned through its corrupted flesh. But it didn't stop. If anything, it seemed to feed on the light, growing brighter, more solid. "Move," I shouted, firing again as the things rushed toward us. The evacuation was a nightmare of running figures and emergency lighting. Emil proved his worth, keeping the civilians organized even as the corrupted creatures pursued us through the tunnel system. We lost 2 people, an elderly man who couldn't keep up, and a young mother who went back for her purse. By the time we reached the surface, the ash storm had intensified. The air was thick with radioactive particles that burned exposed skin and made breathing agony, even through our masks. The sky was the color of infected wounds. "We can't stay here," Emil said, looking at the families we'd saved. "The contamination is spreading too fast." He was right. The safe zones we'd established 12 hours ago were now death traps. The evacuation routes were compromised. And somewhere in the tunnels below, those things were multiplying. I thought about my grandfather's blueprints, the careful measurements and emergency protocols designed for a different kind of disaster. This was beyond anything he'd imagined, beyond anything anyone had imagined. "There's a choice we have to make," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "We can try to save everyone and lose them all, or we can save who we can and write off the rest." Emil stared at me. "You're talking about abandoning people." "I'm talking about reality." I gestured toward the contaminated zones. "The radiation is spreading faster than we can evacuate. The creatures are multiplying. We don't have the resources to save everyone." "Then what do you propose?" I looked at the families huddled around us, at Noah's worried face visible through the command center window, at the glowing ash that continued to fall like toxic snow. "We choose," I said. "We save who we can, and we make sure their sacrifice means something." The storm's ash choked the streets, blood pooling in the toxic haze. In the distance, more screams echoed from the tunnels below. The creatures were learning, adapting, spreading, and we were running out of time. Emergency response log, Jack Goslin, FDNY Hazmat Unit. Date, March 15th, 2025. Time, 22:15 Eastern Standard Time. The man who would change everything stumbled into our command center at 2200 hours, covered in ash and bleeding from claw marks across his face. "My name is Brandon Trudell," he gasped, collapsing against our makeshift barricade. "I worked for Consolidated Energy. You need to know what really happened." Noah and I exchanged glances. Consolidated Energy ran the Indian Point nuclear facility, 40 miles north of the city. It had been offline for routine maintenance when the ash first started falling. "Get him water," I told Noah, then knelt beside the man. Brandon was maybe 35, with the soft build of an office worker and the hollow eyes of someone who'd seen too much. "What do you know about the contamination?" "It wasn't an accident," he whispered, accepting the water with shaking hands. "They knew. God help me, they knew this would happen." Emil moved closer, his face grim. "What are you talking about?" Brandon pulled a blood-stained tablet from his jacket. "I was part of the safety inspection team. We found critical flaws in the containment systems 3 weeks ago. Stress fractures in the reactor core, compromised cooling systems, radiation leaks that were getting worse every day. So why didn't you shut it down? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Because the company was hemorrhaging money. The board decided the risk was acceptable. They called it managed exposure levels. His laugh was bitter. They didn't want to lose their quarterly bonuses. The tablet screen flickered to life, showing internal company documents. Radiation readings that climbed steadily over weeks. Safety reports that had been buried or altered. Email chains discussing acceptable casualty projections for Manhattan. Bastards, Noah muttered. They knew people would die. It gets worse, Brandon continued. The reactor didn't just fail, it was sabotaged. Someone wanted to make sure the contamination would spread as far as possible. Who? Emil demanded. I don't know. But whoever it was, they had access to the core systems. They triggered a cascade failure that turned the reactor into a dirty bomb. I studied the documents, my anger building with each page. Names, dates, cover-ups, all while families were dying in the tunnels below us. Why are you telling us this? Because I helped write those reports, Brandon said, his voice breaking. I signed off on the safety assessments. I'm as guilty as the rest of them. A new sound interrupted us, the screech of metal being torn apart. Through the subway grating above, we could see shadows moving against the ashlit sky. The creatures were getting bolder, venturing onto the streets. We need to move, I said. This position isn't secure anymore. Where can we go? Noah asked. The contamination is spreading faster than we can evacuate. I looked at Brandon's tablet, at the radiation patterns spreading across the city maps. The source, I realized. We need to stop this at the source. The reactor? Brandon shook his head. It's a death trap. The radiation levels around Indian Point are lethal. No one can get close enough to shut it down. Then we find another way. A crash from the tunnel entrance cut our discussion short. One of the barriers we'd erected was buckling inward, metal screaming as something powerful pushed against it. Through the gaps, I could see pale, elongated limbs reaching through. The creatures, Noah said. They found us. Emil was already moving civilians toward the emergency exit. How many? Too many, I replied, watching more shadows gather beyond our defenses. The radiation had changed them, but it had also made them pack hunters. They were learning to coordinate. The first barrier collapsed with a sound like breaking bones. A creature that had once been a businessman squeezed through the gap, its suit hanging in tatters from its stretched frame. Its face was a ruin of blistered flesh and exposed bone, but its eyes held terrible intelligence. The emergency exit, I shouted. Everyone out. We retreated through the subway system, carrying what equipment we could salvage. The creatures followed, their inhuman shrieks echoing off the tunnel walls. Behind us, I could hear them tearing apart our abandoned supplies, searching for something or someone. The emergency exit led to a maintenance tunnel that connected to the old pneumatic postal system. It was cramped, dark, and filled with decades of debris, but it was also lined with lead pipes that provided some protection from radiation. This won't hold them for long, Noah said, sealing the tunnel entrance behind us. It doesn't have to, I replied. We just need enough time to reach the surface. As we crawled through the narrow passage, Brandon continued his story. The sabotage was planned months in advance. Someone wanted to create a disaster that would contaminate the entire northeast corridor. Not just an accident, a weapon. Who would do something like that? Emil asked. I don't know, but I have security footage from the reactor facility. If we can reach my apartment, I can show you who triggered the cascade failure. The tunnel ended at a subway grate near Washington Square Park. Through the metal bars, I could see the ash still falling, thicker now, coating everything in a poisonous blanket. The park itself was unrecognizable, trees twisted into impossible shapes, the ground split by glowing cracks that pulsed with radioactive light. The contamination is accelerating, I observed. It's not just spreading, it's intensifying. The reactor is still melting down, Brandon explained. Every hour makes it worse. Soon the entire city will be uninhabitable. We emerged into a hellscape. The ash storm had turned the night sky into a swirling mass of toxic clouds, lit from within by an unnatural green glow. Buildings showed signs of rapid decay, windows melting, concrete cracking, metal supports bending under their own weight. And everywhere the creatures hunted. They moved through the ash-covered streets like predators, their elongated forms perfectly adapted to the poisoned environment. Some retained enough human appearance to be recognizable, while others had been transformed beyond recognition. They're not just mutated. I realized, watching a group of them coordinate an attack on a stranded police car. They're evolving. The radiation isn't just changing them, Brandon said. It's improving them, making them better hunters. We made our way through the devastated streets, staying to the shadows and avoiding the larger creature packs. Brandon's apartment was only 6 blocks away, but in this environment, it might as well have been on the moon. Halfway there, we found a police barricade that had been overrun. The vehicles were twisted sculptures of melted metal, and the officers' remains were scattered across the ash-covered asphalt. But their equipment was still functional. Radio, Noah said, grabbing a handheld unit. Maybe we can reach the other emergency teams. Static filled the air, punctuated by brief transmissions. Unit 23 were surrounded, requesting immediate. Grand Central Station has fallen. Repeat, Grand Central. The mayor is dead, building collapsed, ash everywhere. Can anyone hear this? Is anyone still alive out there? I took the radio from Noah. This is Hazmat Unit 7, Jack Goslin. We're mobile and have critical information about the contamination source. Any surviving units, please respond. Silence. Then, Unit 7, this is Brooklyn Command. We have maybe 50 people left. The bridges are gone. How bad is it in Manhattan? Bad, I replied. And getting worse. We need to reach Indian Point Nuclear Facility. The contamination is being deliberately spread. That's impossible. The facility is. The transmission cut to static as something massive moved through the ash cloud above us. A shadow the size of a city bus, wings spread wide, circling the ruins of Manhattan like a vulture. What the hell was that? Noah whispered. Brandon stared at the sky, his face pale. Evolution, he said. The radiation isn't just changing people, it's changing everything. The shelter buckled under glowing rubble as another creature landed on the building above us. We ran through streets that had become alien landscapes, past storefronts that glowed with their own light and fire hydrants that sprayed radioactive steam. Brandon's apartment building was still standing, though the upper floors had begun to sag and melt. We climbed 7 flights of stairs that creaked ominously under our weight, past doors that hung open to reveal apartments full of ash and silence. Here, Brandon said, unlocking his door with trembling fingers. The apartment was a monument to corporate paranoia, multiple computer screens, encrypted hard drives, and filing cabinets full of documents. But it was the wall of photographs that caught my attention. Reactor technicians, company executives, facility schematics, and in the center, a single photo of a man in a suit shaking hands with the Indian Point plant manager. That's him, Brandon said, pointing to the photo. Dr. Marcus Webb. He was hired as a consultant 6 months ago. Said he was there to improve safety protocols. But he sabotaged the reactor instead, I concluded. Not just sabotaged, weaponized. He turned it into a delivery system for something much worse than normal radiation. Brandon activated his computer, and security footage filled the screen. I watched as Dr. Webb moved through the reactor facility with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He accessed restricted areas, modified safety systems, and finally, in the crucial moment, triggered the cascade failure that had doomed Manhattan. He's not just a saboteur, I realized. He's a terrorist. And he's still out there, Brandon said. The footage shows him leaving the facility just before the meltdown. He knew exactly what was going to happen. Their greed poisoned the earth beneath our feet. But this wasn't just corporate negligence. It was deliberate mass murder on an unprecedented scale. As if summoned by our discovery, something began scratching at the apartment door. Long, deliberate scrapes that sounded almost like knocking. They followed us, Noah whispered. The scratching stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear breathing on the other side of the door. Slow, labored, but definitely human. Or something that had once been human. We need to go, I said, grabbing Brandon's evidence files. Now, the window led to a fire escape that groaned under our weight. Below us, the ash-covered streets swarmed with creatures. Above us, more shadows circled in the toxic sky. Where can we go? Emil asked. I looked at the evidence in my hands, then at the radiation readings on my instruments. The contamination was spreading faster than ever, and somewhere out there, Dr. Webb was probably watching his handiwork with satisfaction. We find him, I said, and we make him pay. Emergency Response Log, Jack Goslin, FDNY Hazmat Unit. Date, March 16, 2025. Time, 3:30 Eastern Standard Time. The storm's glow incinerated the Manhattan skyline. I'm writing this by the light of burning rubble, watching what's left of my city die. The catastrophic surge began at 3:15, a wall of radioactive ash that swept down from the north like the wrath of God. Times Square, the beating heart of the world, now lies buried under 20 feet of toxic snow that glows with its own hellish light. Emil is dead. The man who tried to save everyone died doing exactly that. The warning came through emergency channels at 3:10. A garbled transmission from what remained of the National Weather Service. Massive contamination event. Indian Point, complete core breach, evacuate immediately. We were still in Brandon's apartment building, downloading the last of his evidence files, when the building's emergency system began screaming. Through the ash-covered windows, I could see it coming, a towering wall of glowing cloud that stretched from horizon to horizon, consuming everything in its path. Jesus Christ, Noah whispered, staring at the approaching storm. How do we outrun that? We couldn't, but Emil tried anyway. The subway tunnels, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. If we can get the civilians underground before the surge hits. There's no time, I protested. Look at it, it's moving too fast. Then we make time. That was Emil. Even facing the impossible, he refused to abandon the people he'd sworn to protect. While Brandon and Noah gathered the evidence, Emil was already on the radio, coordinating with the scattered survivor groups across Manhattan. This is Lagachi. Emergency Evacuation Protocol 7. All surviving units, get your people to the deepest subway stations. The medical tunnels under Bellevue, the old pneumatic system under the financial district. Anywhere with lead lining or deep earth coverage. The responses came back broken and desperate. 23 civilians in Grand Central, no way to move them. Creatures have the tunnels blocked, can't get through. Buildings collapsing, ashes eating through the concrete. Emil looked at me, and I saw the decision in his eyes before he spoke. Jack, you need to get that evidence to someone who can use it. Find Dr. Webb. Stop this at the source. I'm not leaving you here. You're not leaving me, he said, grabbing his emergency pack. I'm staying. Someone has to coordinate the evacuation. The storm hit the northern edge of Manhattan like a sledgehammer. I watched through the window as the Chrysler building simply vanished, swallowed by the advancing wall of destruction. The ash wasn't just falling now. It was flowing, a liquid avalanche of radioactive death that turned concrete to slag and metal to twisted sculptures. Emil, we have to go, Noah urged. Now, get them out of here, Emil told me, pressing his radio into my hands. I'll buy you as much time as I can. The last I saw of him, he was running toward the emergency stairwell, shouting evacuation orders into his backup radio. He knew the building would collapse within minutes of the surge's arrival, but he also knew that every second of warning could save lives. The man died as he lived, putting others first. We made it to the subway entrance as the surge engulfed the apartment building. The sound was indescribable, like 1,000 freight trains mixed with the screams of the damned. The ash hit the street level with such force that manholes covers shot into the air like missiles, and the pavement itself began to buckle and melt. Down, I shouted, diving into the subway entrance just as the first wave of radioactive debris swept overhead. The tunnels shook like an earthquake was tearing them apart. Emergency lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness broken only by the eerie glow seeping through the grates above. The air filled with the stench of melting plastic and burning metal. The ventilation systems, Brandon gasped, pulling out his tablet. If the ash gets into the tunnel networks. He didn't need to finish. The subway system was Manhattan's circulatory system, and the surge was about to poison every vein and artery. We moved through the tunnels in near total darkness, guided only by the emergency lighting that still functioned. The sounds from above were getting worse, not just the roar of the storm, but the screams of the creatures caught in it. Whatever the radiation was doing to them, it was accelerating. They're not dying, Noah observed, listening to the inhuman sounds echoing through the grates. They're changing. The first refugee we encountered was a police officer, her uniform burned and tattered, leading a group of civilians through the train tunnels. She recognized my hazmat gear and stumbled toward us. Thank God, she gasped. How many people are still up there? Too many, I replied. What's your status? We've got maybe 40 people in the medical tunnels under Bellevue. The lead lining is holding, but we're running out of supplies. And the creatures, she shuddered. They're not just hunting anymore. They're organizing. Through the tunnel walls, we could feel the surge passing overhead. The concrete groaned and cracked, and radioactive dust began seeping through the joints. Whatever was happening up there, It was rewriting the fundamental structure of the city. "We need to reach the surface," I said. "Get a visual on the damage." "Are you insane?" the officer protested. "The radiation levels up there will kill you in minutes." "Not if we're fast enough." We found an emergency exit that led to a service tunnel beneath the federal building. The heavy steel doors were designed to withstand nuclear attack, but they were already showing signs of stress. The metal was discolored, and the seals were beginning to fail. "Whatever's in that storm," Brandon said, checking his radiation detector, "it's not just radioactive. It's chemically corrosive on a molecular level." The surface was a moonscape. Times Square, once the most vibrant place on Earth, had become a crater filled with glowing ash. The famous billboards had melted into abstract sculptures, and the buildings themselves were slowly dissolving, their steel frames visible through walls that had become as thin as paper. But it was the sky that truly horrified me. The ash clouds weren't dissipating, they were growing, feeding on themselves, creating a permanent storm system that stretched from horizon to horizon. And within those clouds, shapes moved. Massive forms with wings like torn canvas, circling the ruins of Manhattan like vultures. "It's not stopping," Noah said, his voice hollow. "The contamination, it's not just spreading. It's alive." Through the swirling ash, I could see other parts of the city. The Brooklyn Bridge had collapsed, its cables snapped like guitar strings. The Statue of Liberty was barely visible through the toxic haze, her torch now a beacon of radioactive fire. And everywhere, the creatures moved through the ruins, no longer random monsters, but an organized force. "They're not just evolving," I realized. "They're being directed." Brandon's tablet chimed with an incoming transmission. The screen showed a familiar face, Dr. Marcus Webb, looking remarkably clean and healthy for someone who should have been dead from radiation exposure. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the static, "I trust you're enjoying the show." "You bastard," I snarled. "Do you know how many people you've killed?" "Approximately 2.3 million, according to my calculations, though the final tally should be much higher once the contamination reaches New Jersey and Connecticut." "Why?" Brandon demanded. "Why do this?" Webb's smile was cold. "Because sometimes, Mr. Trudell, you have to burn down the old world to build a new one. The radiation isn't just destroying, it's transforming. Creating something better, stronger, more adaptable. You're insane. I'm evolving. And so is everyone else, whether they want to or not." The transmission cut to static, but the message was clear. This wasn't just terrorism, it was an attempt at forced evolution, using radiation as a catalyst for some twisted vision of humanity's future. "He's still out there," I said, "and he's controlling this somehow." "How?" Noah asked. "The reactor melted down. It should be uncontrollable." "Unless he built in safeguards," Brandon said, studying his stolen files. "Look at this, secondary containment protocols, remote monitoring systems." He didn't just sabotage the reactor. He turned it into a weapon he could control. Above us, the ash storm continued its rampage. I could see it spreading beyond Manhattan now, crossing the rivers, consuming the outer boroughs. In a few hours, it would reach the suburban communities where millions of families were probably huddled in their basements, thinking they were safe. "We have to stop him," I said. "Whatever it takes." "The reactor facility is 40 miles north," Brandon pointed out. "Through the worst of the contamination. Even if we could get there, the radiation levels would be lethal." "Then we find another way." The tunnel shook again as something massive landed on the street above us. Through the cracks in the concrete, I could see a creature the size of a city bus, its form constantly shifting as the radiation continued to reshape it. But there was intelligence in its movements, purpose in its actions. "They're not just evolving," I whispered. "They're being programmed." As if in response to my words, the creature let out a sound that was part roar, part electronic signal. And from across the ruined city, other creatures answered. The contamination surge was over, but the real horror was just beginning. Manhattan was no longer a city, it was a laboratory, and we were all test subjects in Dr. Webb's twisted experiment. But I still had Emil's radio, Brandon's evidence, and Noah's determination. Somewhere out there, Webb was hiding behind his technology, thinking he was safe from the consequences of his actions. He was wrong. The ash settles, but the reckoning has only just begun. Emergency Response Log, Jack Goslin, FDNY Hazmat Unit. Date, March 16th, 2025. Time, 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. His blood stained the glowing ash, my brother's final stand. Noah is dead. The man who stood by me through 7 years of emergency calls, who pulled me from burning buildings and talked me through the worst disasters New York had ever seen, died protecting a group of children in a subway tunnel that became their tomb. I'm writing this in the ruins of what used to be Penn Station, surrounded by the silence of a dead city. The ash has stopped falling, but the damage is complete. Manhattan is gone, not destroyed, but transformed into something that hurts to look at directly. We'd been moving through the tunnel system for 4 hours, following Brandon's stolen intelligence toward a possible exit route, when we heard them, children's voices, crying in the darkness ahead. "There," Noah said, pointing his flashlight toward a collapsed section of tunnel. "Someone's trapped." The debris was fresh, concrete blocks and twisted metal that had fallen during the surge. But through the gaps, we could see movement, hear the desperate sounds of survivors calling for help. "How many?" I asked, assessing the structural damage. "Sounds like maybe 6 or 7 kids," Noah replied, already moving toward the pile. "Teacher, maybe a few parents." Brandon checked his radiation detector. "The levels are spiking. Whatever's trapped in there with them, it's highly contaminated." "We can't just leave them," Noah said. "We can't save them either," I replied, hating myself for the words. "Look at this debris. It'll take hours to clear, and the radiation will kill us all long before we're finished." Noah stared at me like I'd struck him. "Since when do we abandon civilians?" "Since the world ended," I said. "Since we became the last hope of stopping the man who did this." But even as I spoke, I knew Noah wouldn't listen. He'd never abandoned anyone in his life, and he wasn't going to start now. He was already pulling blocks away from the pile, ignoring the clicks from his dosimeter that were coming faster and faster. "Jack, help me with this," he called. I should have stopped him. Should have reminded him of the bigger picture, the millions of lives that depended on us reaching Dr. Webb. Instead, I found myself pulling debris alongside him, because he was my brother and I couldn't watch him die alone. The children were huddled in a classroom that had somehow survived the tunnel collapse. 7 kids, ages maybe 8 to 12, with their teacher, a woman named Sarah who'd kept them calm through the worst disaster in human history. "Thank God," she whispered when she saw us. "We've been trapped for hours." "Are any of you hurt?" Noah asked, kneeling beside the kids. "Emma's got a cut on her leg," Sarah replied. "And Tommy's been coughing since the ash started coming through the ceiling." I looked up at the cracks in the concrete above us. Radioactive dust was seeping through the joints, coating everything in a fine layer of death. The children's clothes were already turning gray, and their skin had the pale, waxy look of radiation sickness. "We need to get them out of here," Noah said. "Now." "The exit's blocked," Brandon pointed out. "And even if we could clear it, the surface is uninhabitable." "Then we find another way." Noah was already organizing the evacuation, turning the rescue into a game to keep the children from panicking. He made up stories about brave explorers navigating underground caves, promised them they'd all be heroes by the end of the day. But I could see the truth in his eyes. He knew we were all going to die down here. The route back to the main tunnel system was treacherous, flooded sections where radioactive water had pooled, collapsed passages that forced us to crawl on our bellies through spaces barely wide enough for the children. Noah carried the youngest, a girl named Emma who'd grown too weak to walk. "Tell me about the fire trucks," she whispered to him. "Well," Noah said, his voice steady despite the chaos around us, "the big red one is called Engine 7. She's got a ladder that reaches all the way to the clouds, and a hose that can knock down buildings." He kept talking, spinning tales of heroic firefighters and magical rescue vehicles, while the radiation ate away at his body cell by cell. By the time we reached the main tunnel, his hair was falling out and his skin was covered in angry red blisters. "Noah," I said quietly, "you need to stop. Rest." "Can't stop," he replied, adjusting his grip on Emma. "These kids are counting on us." The teacher, Sarah, had been getting weaker too. The radiation was affecting her faster than the children. Adults always succumbed first. She collapsed just as we reached the medical tunnels under Bellevue, her body finally giving out after hours of exposure. "I'm sorry," she whispered, blood running from her nose. "Take care of them." Noah knelt beside her, taking her hand. "We will. I promise." But promises were all we had left. The medical tunnels were supposed to be safe, lead-lined walls, filtered air systems, emergency supplies. Instead, we found them overrun with creatures that had once been hospital patients and staff. The radiation had accelerated their transformation, turning them into something that retained enough human intelligence to use tools, but had lost all human compassion. They're waiting for us, Brandon observed, watching the creatures move through the tunnels with obvious purpose. This is a trap, or they're protecting something, I said, studying their movement patterns. There's something in there they don't want us to find. The assault came from 3 directions at once. Creatures that had been doctors and nurses, their white coats now fused to their mutated flesh, attacked with surgical precision. They moved like they were performing an operation, each action calculated and coordinated. Noah put himself between the children and the creatures, using his body as a shield while I tried to find us an escape route. But there were too many of them, and they were learning, adapting to our tactics even as we fought. The emergency shaft, Brandon called out, pointing to a maintenance ladder that led upward. If we can reach it, take the kids, Noah told me, pulling out his emergency axe. I'll hold them off. Noah, no. That's an order, Lieutenant, he said, using my old rank from our army days. Get those kids to safety. The last I saw of him, he was standing in a tunnel filled with monsters, his axe raised high, buying us precious seconds with his life. The creatures swarmed over him like a tide, but he kept fighting, kept swinging, until the sounds of battle faded behind us. His blood stained the glowing ash, mixing with the radioactive dust that coated everything. My brother, not by blood, but by choice, died as he had lived, protecting the innocent. We emerged from the tunnels into a world that no longer made sense. The sky was the color of old brass, shot through with veins of green light. The buildings that remained standing had been transformed into organic sculptures, their surfaces rippling like living tissue. And everywhere, the creatures moved with purpose, following some grand design that only they understood. The children, I said, looking around at the 7 kids who'd survived the journey. What do we do with them? There's a survivor camp in Queens, Brandon said, checking his tablet. If we can get across the river. The bridges are gone, I reminded him. And the tunnels are flooded. Then we find a boat. But even as we planned our next move, I knew the truth. The children were dying. The radiation had marked them all, and no amount of medical care could save them now. We weren't rescuing them. We were just making their final hours a little less terrifying. Emma, the girl Noah had carried, looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. Where's the nice man who told us about the fire trucks? I started, then stopped. How do you explain sacrifice to a child? How do you make sense of a world where good people die for nothing? He's fighting the bad guys, I said finally, so you can be safe. She smiled, and for a moment, she looked like a normal 8-year-old again. Like a superhero? Yeah, I said, my voice breaking. Like a superhero. We found shelter in the ruins of a church, its stained glass windows now glowing with their own radioactive light. While the children slept, I studied Brandon's evidence files, looking for any clue that might help us stop Dr. Webb. The truth was worse than I'd imagined. The sabotage at Indian Point wasn't the beginning. It was the culmination of a plan that had been years in the making. Dr. Webb worked for a consortium of corporations and government agencies that had been secretly testing radiation-based weapons since the 1950s. Manhattan was just the proof of concept. Look at this, Brandon said, showing me a document marked Project Genesis. They've identified 12 other reactor sites across the country. If Webb can trigger them all, he could contaminate the entire continent, I finished. Not contaminate, Brandon corrected. Transform. According to these files, they believe the radiation will create a new form of human evolution. They're calling it Homo superior. The children began coughing in their sleep, blood on their lips. Emma was the first to go, slipping away quietly while I held her hand. The others followed over the next few hours, one by one, until only Brandon and I remained in the radioactive ruins of what had been God's house. We have to stop him, I said, staring at the small bodies covered in Noah's emergency blankets. Whatever it takes. The reactor facility is still 40 miles north, Brandon pointed out, through the worst of the contamination zone. Even if we could get there, Webb will be expecting us. Then we surprise him. I pulled out the radio I'd inherited from Emil, scanning for any surviving emergency frequencies. Most were silent, but one channel crackled with a familiar voice. This is Dr. Marcus Webb, broadcasting to all survivors. The transformation is proceeding according to plan. Those who embrace the change will inherit the earth. Those who resist will be consumed by it. You son of a bitch, I growled into the radio. This is Jack Goslin, FDNY. I'm coming for you. Webb's laughter was like broken glass. Ah, Mr. Goslin. I've been monitoring your progress. Quite impressive, really. You've managed to survive longer than most. long enough to shut down your operation. My operation? You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about me. This is about evolution, about humanity's next step. You're talking about genocide. I'm talking about rebirth. The old world was dying anyway, pollution, war, disease. I've simply accelerated the process, given it purpose. And the children? The innocent people who died because of your madness. Acceptable losses. Every revolution requires sacrifice. The transmission cut to static, but I'd heard enough. Webb was still at the reactor facility, still controlling the contamination flow. If I could reach him, if I could shut down his operation. It's suicide, Brandon said, reading my thoughts. The radiation levels around Indian Point are lethal. You'd be dead before you got within a mile of the facility. Then we find another way in. I looked at the evidence files, at the children's bodies, at the radioactive wasteland that had been my city. Noah was dead. Emil was dead. Millions of innocent people were dead or dying. But I was still alive, still fighting. Their greed had poisoned the earth, but their arrogance would be their downfall. Dr. Webb thought he was untouchable, protected by his technology and his mutated guardians. He was about to learn the difference between evolution and justice. Emergency response log, Jack Goslin, FDNY Hazmat Unit. Date, March 16, 2025. Time, 14h. The ash settles over the ruins, grandfather's blueprints buried in radioactive rubble. Brandon Trudell died at 1347, his body shielding the reactor's emergency shutdown system as Dr. Webb's final gambit tore through the facility's containment structure. The man who helped create this nightmare found redemption in its ending, though the price was everything we had left. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me record what really happened in those final hours, before the radiation claims what's left of my memory. The approach to Indian Point was a journey through hell's architecture. The Hudson River had become a flowing mass of liquid light, its waters so radioactive they glowed like molten metal. The trees along the riverbank had crystallized into glass sculptures, their branches reaching toward a sky that pulsed with unnatural aurora. The contamination is accelerating, Brandon observed, checking his instruments. Whatever Webb is doing, he's pushing the reactor beyond critical. We'd commandeered a lead-lined maintenance truck from the ruins of a construction site, its heavy shielding our only protection against the radiation that made the air itself burn. Through the windshield, we could see the reactor facility rising from the contaminated landscape like a cancer-given form. The buildings had been transformed. Concrete had become something organic, pulsing with veins of green light. The cooling towers were no longer structures but living things, breathing out clouds of radioactive steam that formed shapes in the air, faces, hands, screaming mouths that dispersed and reformed in endless cycles. He's not just using the reactor, I realized. He's merged with it. The first of Webb's guardians appeared as we approached the facility perimeter. They had been security guards once, their uniforms now fused to flesh that rippled like water. But they moved with purpose, following radio signals that came from somewhere deep within the reactor complex. They're not just mutated, Brandon said, watching them coordinate their movements. They're networked, connected to some kind of central intelligence. Webb, I said. He's controlling them directly. The assault on the facility was less a battle than a surgical procedure. The Guardians didn't attack randomly. They moved to corral us, to drive us toward specific areas where the radiation was strongest. They wanted us alive, but transformed, added to their collective consciousness. The main reactor building, Brandon said, pointing to a structure that seemed to breathe. That's where he'll be, where the core control systems are located. Or what's left of them. The entrance to the reactor building was a mouth lined with teeth made of twisted metal. Emergency lights had grown into the walls like tumors, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The air was thick enough to taste, every breath a dose of poison that made my vision blur and my hands shake. Jack, Brandon said, his voice already weakening. I need to tell you something. Save it for after we stop this. There might not be an after. He pulled out a small device, its screen showing radiation levels that were off the charts. The core isn't just melting down, it's evolving, becoming something new. What are you talking about? The radiation isn't random. It's following patterns, creating structures, building something. Webb isn't just using the reactor, he's turning it into a living organism. The corridor ahead of us pulsed with bioluminescent growth, veins of light that carried information like a nervous system. We were no longer in a building, We were inside something alive, something that watched our every move and reported back to its master. The control room, I said, following the building's layout from memory. If we can reach it. The control room is gone, Brandon interrupted. Look. Through a gap in the organic walls, I could see what remained of the reactor's heart. The control systems had been absorbed into something that defied description, a fusion of technology and biology that pulsed with its own intelligence. And at its center, connected by cables that had grown into his flesh, was Dr. Marcus Webb. He was no longer entirely human. The radiation had transformed him into something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Part man, part machine, part living nuclear reaction. His eyes were pools of green fire, and when he smiled, his teeth were made of crystallized uranium. Welcome, gentlemen, Webb said, his voice coming from speakers that had grown like fruit from the ceiling. You're just in time for the final phase. It's over, Webb, I said, raising my weapon. Whatever you've done here, we're shutting it down. Shutting it down? Webb's laughter was the sound of atoms splitting. You still don't understand. This isn't a reactor anymore, it's a chrysalis. Humanity's cocoon. You're insane. I'm evolved. And soon, everyone will be. The walls around us began to pulse faster, and I could feel the radiation levels spiking. Through the organic windows, I could see the other reactor sites across the country beginning to glow. Webb was activating them all, turning the entire continental United States into a transformation chamber. The emergency shutdown, Brandon whispered, pointing to a control panel that had been partially absorbed into the living wall. If we can reach it. It won't work, Webb said, reading our thoughts through the building's neural network. The system is beyond your primitive understanding now. It's alive and it wants to live. Then we kill it. I moved toward the control panel, but the building itself fought back. Tendrils of living metal reached for me, and the floor began to dissolve under my feet. The radiation was so intense that my skin was blistering, and I could taste blood in my mouth. Jack, Brandon called out, pulling explosives from his pack. Get to the panel, I'll clear you a path. Brandon, no. This is my fault, he shouted over the building's screams. I helped create this monster. I have to be the one to stop it. The explosives detonated in sequence, tearing through the organic walls and exposing the reactor's true core. It was beautiful and terrible, a miniature sun held in a cage of living flesh, pulsing with the rhythm of a cosmic heartbeat. And feeding directly from it, Webb's transformed body channeled that energy across the continent. You cannot stop evolution. Webb raged, his form beginning to lose cohesion as the building's nervous system was damaged. I am become death, destroyer of worlds. No, I said, reaching the emergency panel. You're just another terrorist with delusions of grandeur. The shutdown sequence was complex, requiring multiple keys and authorization codes. But I had something Webb didn't expect: my grandfather's emergency protocols, the same ones that had guided 3 generations of emergency responders. The same ones that had been built into every nuclear facility in the country as a failsafe against exactly this kind of disaster. The legacy codes, Webb hissed, recognizing what I was doing. Impossible. Those were classified beyond top secret. My grandfather helped design them, I said, entering the final sequence. He knew that someday, someone would try to use these reactors as weapons. The emergency shutdown began, but Webb wasn't finished. With the last of his strength, he triggered a final surge, sending a pulse of pure radiation through the building's structure. The blast caught Brandon as he tried to reach the secondary controls, burning through his protective suit and flooding his body with enough radiation to kill him instantly. But he didn't die instantly. With the last of his strength, he pulled himself to the manual override and activated the physical lockdown that would prevent any further contamination releases. Tell them, he gasped, his body already beginning to dissolve. Tell them what really happened here. I will, I promised, watching the light fade from his eyes. I'll make sure they know. Webb's scream echoed through the dying building as his connection to the other reactor sites was severed. The network he'd built to transform humanity collapsed, taking him with it. His body simply came apart, the radiation that had sustained him finally consuming what was left of his humanity. The building shuddered and began to collapse, its organic components dying as the reactor core finally achieved stable shutdown. I ran through corridors that were reverting to concrete and steel, racing the collapse as the structure returned to its original form. I made it outside just as the reactor building imploded, taking Webb's nightmare with it. The other facilities across the country were shutting down automatically, their own emergency protocols triggered by the master site's shutdown. But the damage was done. Manhattan was gone, transformed into something that would glow for 1,000 years. The Hudson Valley was uninhabitable, and millions of people were dead or dying from radiation exposure. I walked through the ruins of what had been my world, carrying Brandon's evidence files and the radiation detector that had belonged to my grandfather. The ash was finally settling, covering everything in a blanket of radioactive snow. But underneath that ash, I could see signs of life, plants that had adapted to the radiation, insects that glowed with their own light, the first stirrings of a new ecosystem. Maybe Webb had been right about evolution. Maybe this was how the world changed, not through gradual adaptation, but through catastrophic transformation. But if that was true, then humanity would adapt too. We always had. I found a group of survivors in a lead-line bunker outside Peekskill, families who had followed the old emergency protocols and taken shelter when the warnings came. They were sick, scared, and uncertain about the future. But they were alive, and they were human. "What happens now?" asked Maria Santos, a teacher who had saved 37 students by getting them to the bunker in time. "Now we rebuild," I said, pulling out my grandfather's emergency blueprints. "We adapt. We survive." The plans were old, designed for a different kind of disaster, but the principles were sound. Radiation shielding, air filtration, sustainable food production. Everything needed to build a new civilization in the radioactive ruins of the old one. "Will it work?" asked David Brighton, an engineer who had escaped from the city just ahead of the surge. "It has to," I replied. "It's all we have left." Over the following days, more survivors emerged from bunkers and shelters across the region. They brought skills, knowledge, and most importantly, hope. The emergency protocols that had saved them were the same ones my grandfather had helped design, passed down through generations of emergency responders who had understood that disasters were not just something that happened to other people. "You saved us all," Maria said, watching as we began construction on the first permanent shelter. "No," I said, looking at the plans that bore my grandfather's signature. "We saved ourselves, just like we always have." The radiation detector that had belonged to my family for 3 generations finally gave out on the 4th day, its circuits fried by the ambient contamination. But by then, we had other instruments, other ways of measuring the danger and finding the safe paths through the ruins. Dr. Webb had been wrong about evolution. It wasn't about becoming something new. It was about becoming something better. And sometimes becoming better meant going back to the things that had always worked: community, cooperation, and the knowledge that had been passed down from those who came before. I buried the detector next to the foundation of our new shelter, along with Noah's badge and Emil's radio. They were relics of the old world, but they had helped create the new one. Their sacrifice had meaning, because we chose to give it meaning. The ash continues to fall, but less each day. The wind carries it away from our settlement, toward the ocean where it will eventually settle to the bottom and become part of the Earth's story. In 100 years, maybe 1,000, the radiation will fade and the land will heal. But we won't wait that long. We'll build new cities in the ruins of the old ones, plant new forests in the radioactive soil, and raise new generations who will know how to live in a world that glows in the dark. The legacy isn't in the blueprints or the protocols or the emergency equipment. It's in the choice to keep going, to keep building, to keep hoping even when the world ends. My grandfather understood that. Noah understood that. Emil understood that. And now so do I. The ash settles, but we endure. End of log entry. Status: mission complete. Reactor network shut down. Casualties: Brandon Trudell, Kia, heroic sacrifice. Dr. Marcus Webb, terminated. Survivors: 847 confirmed in Hudson Valley region. Legacy: emergency protocol network activated, reconstruction initiated. Final entry: March 20th, 2025, new settlement day 1.